Hi everyone, it's Joe and welcome back. This is RAD104 and this is lecture 1.2 and we're talking about fluoroscopy and we're talking about fluoroscopy equipment. And in ending my last lecture, my last video anyway, we were talking about, I mentioned something called lux, and I just wanted to define what that is. It's a way of measuring illumination levels. And so when you look at your computer screen, there's an illumination level to it. When you look at a light bulb, there's illumination levels to it. And so we measure that in lux. And what a lux is, it's a units of lumens per square meter. Do you really need to know that? Not really. But as long as you know that lux is really the illumination level of whatever it is that we're looking at, or the light reflecting out of it, that's what we're talking about. Now, when we're talking about reading X-ray images or medical images, you probably have noticed that radiologists are sitting in a darkened room. And so we try to get that atmosphere, or the amount of lumens within that area, to be between 100 and 1,000 lux. And there's reasons for that. The cells within our eyes adapt depending on how much light there is in a room. And so that's what we're going to be talking about right now. Now, when we're talking about fluoroscopy, if you look at these images, you can see some old-fashioned images, especially the one on the bottom with Thomas Edison using his fluoroscope, and the one above it on the right, the gentleman's using a fluoroscope. And you can see that the eyes are kind of enclosed to not let the light in. Your eyes had to adjust in order for you to see these dim images. Remember, the X-ray tubes that they're using are not very strong, and so the X-ray coming or produced wasn't very strong, and so the images were very, very faint. The image on the top left is kind of an old fluoroscopic type of equipment where X-ray is behind the gentleman standing up, and X-ray is coming through his body and hitting this kind of fluoroscopic panel. And so you can see that the doctor's eyes are not being kind of hidden behind a blinder, but he's able to see that image, but it would be very faint. Back in the past, radiologists had to wait for their eyes to adjust, the cells in their eyes to adapt to the darkness. I don't know if you've ever been out late at night, or if you've ever gone from a bright room with a lot of light into a dark room. You really can't see much at all. But if you wake up in the middle of the night, your eyes have been closed, you're in darkness, and you get up to, I don't know, use the restroom, or to get up to let out the dog or whatever, you can see in the dark a whole lot better. So your eyes do adjust to the darkness. And those cells, once they are stimulated, they can pull out a lot better detail once they're adjusted to the dark. And so back in the past, radiologists had to wait for their eyes to do just that. As you can imagine, this would slow the whole process down of patient care, and it takes a while for your eyes to adjust. So the thought was, well, is there any way to make these dim X-ray images brighter? And that's where the thought of image intensification came out. And so what we're trying to do is take the dim X-ray image and brighten it up, make it so bright that we don't have to wait for our eyes to adjust and we can see it right away. So let's talk about the two types of cells that we have in the eye. The first type I'm going to talk about are the cones. And cones are used for daylight color vision. It's called photopic vision. That's something that you might want to know for the test. Cones are in the back of the eye, and they're heavily concentrated in the back of the eye. That means when you look directly at something, you'll be able to see it, and you're using those cone cells. In the back of the eye, where that concentration of cone cells is located, is called the fovea centralis. You need at least 100 lux for these cells to be stimulated. There's great contrast perception. That means that you're able to determine brightness levels just by looking at it, and it's the cone cells that give you that contrast perception. So cone cells, they're for daytime vision, they're for photopic vision, color vision. They're packed really intensely in the back of the eye. And so that's what you have cone cells for. They're great for pulling out detail, and you need at least 100 lux for them to become stimulated. Now the other cell of the eye are the rods. Rods are located on the periphery of the eyeball because you have the cones concentrated in the back. So with rods, they're on the periphery, and they are used for night vision or scotopic vision, something you might want to remember for the test. And rods are more sensitive to light and only require 2 lux in order for them to become stimulated. The other nice thing about the rod cells is that they are really good at pulling out detail for anything that's kind of black and white. And so X-ray images that we look at are black and white. So if we could kind of stimulate both the rods and the cones, that means we're going to get detailed vision by using both of them if it's possible. So that's why we have the light levels somewhat low, not very, very bright. That allows for the cones to be stimulated in order for us to see color, perception of different brightness levels. And we can also pull the rods into that, which help with black and white detail. So that's why something around 100 lux, maybe up to 1,000 lux, depending on the radiologist and what they're used to. They're in a dimly lit room around that light level to see if we can stimulate both the rods and the cones to get the best detail possible. And so, yes, we're trying to get the right illumination level within the environment, whether it be the reading room or if this radiologist is working at home or in a fluoroscopy room. You can see that they'll adjust the light levels to where they want them to be. And that allows both the rods and the cones to be stimulated in order for them to see the detail that they need to pull out a good diagnosis on that image. And so the device created in order for a radiologist to walk into a fluoroscopy room and have the illumination level set automatically without having his eyes adjust so that he can see the image was an image intensifier. Now, image intensifiers were developed by John Coltman in the late 40s, 1948, and it was to get these dim images to become brighter, and so at least to 100 lux in real time. So there's no wait. You just walk in, see the image right away with great detail. Now, image intensifiers are going away because flat panel plates are taking over. They're a little bit more simple. They're lighter. There's less that can go wrong with them as far as maintenance goes. I think that the flat panel detector is going to take over image intensifiers fairly soon. But they are still around, and they are still on the registry, so you should know all about them. A lot of your C-arms will probably have an image intensifier. It's got a dome structure. I know that Beverly Fluoroscopy still uses an image intensifier. The Addison Gilbert Fluoroscopy room has an image intensifier. Salem, you have one image intensifier, but the other one is no longer an image intensifier. And Southern New Hampshire, you don't have any. You guys are all cutting edge. So regardless of where you're going to clinical, you still need to know how these things work for the registry. Now, as far as X-ray goes, the X-ray tube in this C-arm here is down here, and it's the same X-ray tube that you're going to find in any X-ray room. It's the same device. It works the same exact way. X-ray goes from the bottom here and is shot up through the patient, and it's hit by the image intensifier. It takes the dim image and it intensifies it and gives it to a brightness level that we're able to see it without any problem. So since the X-ray works the same way, we're just going to be talking about the image intensifier. And you're going to learn how X-ray is turned into a bright light in order for it to be shown on a monitor bright enough for the doctor to see it. All right, so there are different levels to an image intensifier, and we're going to pretend we're an X-ray that has been shot out of the tube, it's gone through the patient, and we're heading towards the image intensifier, and the first thing we hit is the input phosphor. The input phosphor is made up of cesium iodide. Now you should remember cesium iodide because it is a scintillator, which is used in indirect digital radiography. That means it turns X-ray into light. And so remember when we were talking about thin film transistors and we talked about CCD chips back last semester, one of the ways of making light was cesium iodide. The other way was gadolinium oxysulfide, but with input phosphors of an image intensifier, they're generally made up of cesium iodide. So the first step in image intensification is turning X-ray into a light source. And we just did that by hitting the input phosphor, which is made up of cesium iodide. Now the intensity of the light from the input phosphor, from the cesium iodide, is going to be dependent on the amount of energy behind the X-ray photon. So if I'm an X-ray photon that has a lot of energy, I'm going to strike the cesium iodide with more energy and I'm going to create a brighter light. If I've got less energy, it's going to be a dimmer light. So just remember that. All right, the next step in the process is to take the light that's been created by the cesium iodide and change it into an electron. Now, it might seem funny because we just wanted to get it into light anyway. Why are we taking this extra step of turning them into electrons? Because we can control the movement of electrons. We cannot really control the movement of light. Light goes everywhere. Okay, and you can see that the input phosphor and the photocathode are glued together. You can see the yellow and the orange are right next to each other. So there's no distance. There's a distance to travel here, and I'll explain why in a little bit. We need to have electrons created because we can control those electrons. We can make them move in a particular way or not move, and that's the important part. We don't want them to move in order to hold the image that it's captured. Let me explain that. The electrons that are created make up a pattern that match what the X-ray image is. Okay, so all of the electrons that are popping off, where there's strong X-ray, there's a lot of electrons. Where there's dim X-ray or dim light, there's less electrons. Where there's no X-ray, there's no electrons. But those electrons are held in place. Those electrons cannot move. And so if you could just think of an X-ray image, if you could take a bunch of electrons and look at it as an image, it matches the X-ray image that you're eventually going to see. So we keep them all in place because that's how we intensify the image. These electrons have enough energy behind it to create even more light than we had before. If you look at the diagram, remember we're trying to make an X-ray image brighter, so we need as much light as possible. You can see that from going from one X-ray photon, we create 1,000 photons of light. That's very efficient, and that's great, but we need it even brighter. And so what we do is change that into electrons. The electrons are, again, in the same pattern as the X-ray image itself. They go up, and they need the distance to get the energy to hit an output phosphor, which is positively charged, so you get negative electrons. They shoot up, they hit this output phosphor, and with that much energy, they've now created 3,000 photons of light. So we've intensified the image, we've intensified the amount of light needed to see that image brighter. Now, if I haven't lost you at this point, how do we keep those electrons together? Because around the rim of the image intensifier, and that's why it's a dome structure, is we've got these electrostatic lenses. These things, this is a cross section, but if you can imagine these rings going around the whole thing, they keep those electrons in place. And again, you've got this larger distance for those electrons to travel up. They get condensed, right? They're getting tighter and tighter and tighter and smaller and smaller and smaller. When they finally hit that output phosphor, all of that energy, all of that mass put together creates a tremendous amount of light, and we've just intensified the image to become much brighter. So the pattern so far goes like this, and this is really what it comes down to. X-ray hits the input phosphor and turns it into light. Okay? The input phosphor, light, hits the photocathode, which turns it into an electron. That electron is then drawn up by a positively charged anode, and it stays in place. It doesn't float around. It doesn't go off in a different direction. It stays in place. Those electrons match the image you're eventually going to see. As they move up, they get condensed, tighter and tighter and tighter, and then when all of those electrons hit this output phosphor, it creates even more light. Even more light. And so we still have that image. So again, X-ray to light, light to electrons, electrons back into light, brighter light, and we get our image. All right, I'm almost done with this lecture, so hang in there, we're almost there. So the last piece of this puzzle is this anode and output phosphor, okay? The anode is a piece of metal that's positively charged. That's why the negatively charged electrons are drawn to it. So you need something positive to attract those electrons, and that's what we have is the anode. As the electrons pass through this anode, they interact with an output phosphor made up of zinc cadmium sulfide. I don't think that's going to be in the registry. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Fact is, those electrons are turned back into light. And because of the concentration of them, because of the energy associated with them, they create a brighter light. They create a brighter light, and that's image intensification. One important thing to remember is that everything is in proportion. I know I mentioned that one X-ray photon turns into 1,000 light photons, which turns into like 50 electrons, and then 3,000. They always stay in the same ratio of one another. Even though the numbers change, the ratio doesn't change. And so the brightness levels will go up, but the pattern of everything stays the same throughout this whole process. And like I said, when you get out of that output phosphor, you're looking at a very bright light, which can now be measured using a charge coupled device, or in the old fashioned ways, we used to use a video camera, and then we can put it on a monitor. All right, guys, I'm sorry for this video being so long, but I wanted to keep that process all in one video. Hopefully you're using this to kind of back up whatever it is that I talked about in class. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you at the next video.